Okay, so let's unpack this deep dive. We've got a stack of sources today that are, well, they're going to challenge some long-held beliefs about something pretty fundamental.
Hmm.
What causes weight gain?
Right.
We're looking mainly at insights pulled from, I believe, a recent Spanish study and a Chinese study.
Exactly. And for a long time, the conversation around weight, it's been heavily focused on a pretty simple energy balance idea. The calories you eat versus the calories you burn.
Standard equation.
Yeah, the standard
Huh.
thing. But these sources, they kind of push back on that. They suggest there are significant factors outside of just diet and exercise sort of hiding in our environment.
And this is where it gets really interesting, isn't it?
Hmm.
Our mission for this deep dive is really to cut through some of that noise and understand how these environmental factors, we're talking specific chemicals, even the air we breathe, how they're being linked to obesity. It just adds these surprising new layers to how we think about our health and, well, the world around us.
Absolutely. So we're going to try and zero in on the key findings from these studies, pull out most surprising details, and then, figure out what this information actually means for you.
Okay, great. So let's jump into that first big piece from the sources.
Hmm.
This idea about persistent chemicals. Some of them haven't been widely used in decades, apparently, but they might still be influencing our weight today.
That's right. The Spanish study, it really dug into what are known as persistent organic pollutants, or POPs.
So like KOPs.
Yeah. And these are chemicals that are just incredibly slow to break down, both in the environment and, crucially, once they get inside our bodies.
So they stick around.
They really do. The researchers were specifically looking for residues of chemicals like DDE, which is basically a leftover from the old pesticide DDT.
Right, I've heard of DDT.
Yeah, and also lindane, another chemical once used in farming, and interestingly, even in some health products back in the day. And polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs,
Here.
those were used a lot in industry and construction.
Okay, so a range of sources there. And they didn't just look for these chemicals floating around, did they? They went right to the source, analyzing samples from body fat.
Yeah, taken directly from the body fat of over 300 study participants. That feels pretty direct, method-wise.
It does. So what did they find?
Well, here's the really striking part. These chemicals, even though they've been banned or severely restricted in many places for decades,
Yeah.
they were detected in the fat tissue samples of every single participant in that study.
Wow, every single one.
Yeah.
That's incredible and kind of unnerving, actually.
It is.
So even if we stopped using them widely, they're clearly still circulating and getting into us.
Mm-hmm.
The sources mentioned diet as a major pathway, right?
Precisely. These chemicals, they're what's called lipophilic.
Meaning they like fat.
Basically, yeah.
Yeah.
They love fat. So they tend to accumulate higher up the food chain, particularly in the fatty tissues of animals. So when we eat fatty animal products, we can end up ingesting these accumulated POPs.
Okay, that makes sense. And the Spanish researchers, they found a link between the levels of these toxins in the body fat and certain health markers.
Yes, they saw a clear association. Participants who had higher concentrations of these specific POPs, like DDE, lindane, PCBs, in their fat tissue, they tended to have higher body weight
A higher body.
and also elevated cholesterol levels.
Right. Okay, so there's a statistical correlation there. Having more of these stored chemicals seems linked to being heavier and having higher cholesterol.
Yeah.
But the sources hinted it might be more than just storage, didn't they? Like something more active.
Yes, and this is a really crucial insight from the research, I think. The study suggests that these POPs might not just sit passively in our fat cells.
Okay.
Instead, exposure could actually promote the growth and even the multiplication of fat cells themselves.
Whoa, wait. Promote growth and multiplication.
Yeah. Think of it like these chemicals might be sort of encouraging the body to create more storage space for fat. It implies a much more active role in weight gain than we previously understood.
That really is a significant shift in thinking. Not just storing fat, but potentially driving the creation of more fat tissue. Okay, so we have this connection between these old, persistent chemicals accumulating in us, potentially influencing fat growth. But the sources also looked beyond chemicals in food, right? They broadened the scope.
Yes, absolutely. They bring in findings from that Chinese study you mentioned, which looked at a completely different environmental factor, air pollution.
Air pollution and weight, how did they study that?
Well, this was a large study, over 13,400 people across 125 different cities. They examined the relationship between the quality of the air people were breathing and their body mass index, their BMI.
Okay, large scale. And what did that picture look like?
The study revealed a pretty distinct trend. In cities with worse air quality, the average BMI of the population tended to be higher.
Hmm. Independent of other factors.
Well, they try to control for factors, but the association was there. Higher pollution, higher average BMI.
Was there any specific pollutant that seemed particularly important in their findings?
Carbon monoxide, CO, was highlighted as having a notable influence.
Carbon monoxide. Okay,
Yeah.
like from car exhaust.
Exactly. It's a toxic gas produced mainly by combustion, so vehicle exhaust, industrial emissions, but also things closer to home like gas stoves or even wood smoke.
Right.
We know it affects our blood's ability to carry oxygen, but this study links higher exposure levels to a higher BMI as well.
So just being exposed to air with higher levels of pollutants like carbon monoxide, which is often the case in urban environments, is being linked to higher body weight. And this seems to be separate from diet or exercise habits.
Right. It just introduces another potentially powerful environmental variable into this really complex equation of weight regulation.
Wow. So putting these pieces together, these persistent chemicals that just linger for decades, and then the air pollution from our daily lives,
Yeah.
it really does challenge that simplified view of weight gain, doesn't it?
It really does.
It suggests our weight might be significantly influenced not just by, what we eat or how much we move, but also by the chemical environment we're living in, both right now and sort of the legacy of past pollution.
Exactly. It broadens the context considerably. And, based on these findings, the sources do offer some, let's say, initial ideas on potential ways to maybe reduce exposure to some of these environmental factors.
Okay, what kind of steps are suggested based on this research?
Well, one kind of common sense suggestion, given the lipophilic nature of POPs, is maybe focusing on less fatty cuts of animal products, since that's where these things tend to accumulate.
Right, less fat, potentially less accumulation. Makes sense.
Another point raised is considering organic produce. Analyses often show lower or sometimes non-detectable levels of pesticide residues compared to conventional crops, so that might reduce some exposure there.
Okay, organic options. What about fish? Because we often hear about the health benefits, the omega-3s. But is there a catch, according to these sources?
Yeah, that's a good point. While definitely acknowledging the value of omega-3 fatty acids found in fish,
Right.
the sources do note that fish, especially larger or fattier species that live longer, can also accumulate toxins like mercury and, yes, POPs from the water they live in.
So it's a trade-off sometimes.
It can be. They suggest being mindful of this potential exposure when choosing fish, maybe vary the types you eat, or perhaps look at alternative sources for omega-3s if this accumulation issue is a significant concern for you.
It's fascinating how interconnected everything really is. Our personal health, the food we choose, the air we happen to breathe, and even environmental decisions made like decades ago.
Absolutely.
So just to recap quickly for everyone listening, we've really dived into how these persistent chemicals, things like DDE, lindane, PCBs, leftovers from past pesticides and industrial use, can build up in our fat tissue.
Yeah, often coming through sources like fatty animal products.
Right. And how studies are linking higher levels of these stored toxins to increased body weight and cholesterol.
And then there's that other angle, the intriguing link found between air pollution, specifically carbon monoxide from combustion sources, and higher BMI in urban populations.
Plus that really provocative idea that these substances might not just sit there passively, but could actively encourage our bodies to grow more fat cells.
Yeah, that potential mechanism is really something. Thinking about all this research, it just highlights the much broader context of health, doesn't it? It goes way beyond just individual choices sometimes.
It really does. So, okay, here's a provocative thought for you to consider, building on everything we've just explored. If these chemicals, some of them banned decades ago, are still being found in people's bodies today, and they're being linked to widespread health issues like obesity and high cholesterol, what does that truly reveal about the incredibly long-term legacy of pollution? And I guess how deeply intertwined our personal health is with the health of the environment all around us, not just for us now, but potentially for generations yet to come.